Welcome to the Mystic Lighthouse, your beacon for the paranormal. Each week we will explore a grab bag of different cryptid sightings, hauntings, UFO encounters, and various other true tales that are sure to leave you questioning, what are you willing to believe? Hello everyone, and welcome to the Mystic Lighthouse. You've heard of paranormal investigators hunting for ghosts, but what happens when you're the one being hunted? A listener tells us exactly how that feels. Strange phenomenon and sightings in the sky will hear an account of one person's very real UFO sighting. And have you ever stared death in the face? One of our listeners feels that he has. So get ready for this week's Tales from the Mystic Lighthouse. Our first story is from Alexander, and he tells us of his encounter with a tall shadow being.
Hi there, and thank you for asking me to share this story, and thank you everyone who's listening to this recount. I just want to warn anyone that because the nature of the story is pretty frightening, and did actually happen to me, that this may be a little intense. So anyway, I guess I'll start with some history or some context. This event happened in the early 2010s. I was about 20 or so at the time, 20 years old, and my family and I, it was a very, very difficult and sad time for my family and I, because we're just coming back from living overseas, and we were making the trip from Southern California, because we landed at LAX, to Northern California, where my aunt was living in hospice because she was passing from cancer, and that my aunt happened to be my dad's sister, younger sister. So this was a very, very difficult time for him as well. Not only because, he was losing a family member, but because he had basically raised her all of her young life. And they were very close. So being the older sibling, watching your younger sister pass away is I can't even imagine it. So because of that, there was a lot of dark energy kind of surrounding us, just negative energy, not to sound all spooky, whatnot. But there was just a really like a dark cloud hanging over us the entire time. That whatever cloud was following us around was feeding off of this sadness, and I had never seen my dad like this before. So anyway, we get to Southern California, get to Los Angeles, and we basically immediately hop from there into a rental car and start our trip. Along the way, we have to stop at one of my cousins on my mom's side's house to stay, because we can't we can't find anywhere short notice, for 3 people and a pet and whatnot. And my cousins offered, so we stayed at their house. For context on that, they live in a very large house, and they're a house with multiple rooms, and I usually end up staying in their son's room because it's the only room available in the house, especially after my folks were staying there, multiple occupants. So the thing about it is, these cousins of mine, they lost their son. Their son was murdered in the early 90s in a very high-profile case for the time, and a famous director, I can't really say who, just for the privacy of everyone involved, including my own family, made a film about it in 2002, and without asking permission of my family, and so it was a very big case, and so as you can imagine, it's pretty eerie staying in his room because it's kept the exact same way it was before he died. And so we get to the house and we have dinner, of course, and then we get ready for bed, and of course I'm freaking out because it's a terrible night. The wind is gusting outside. The trees are really blowing, Santa Ana winds, and there's a bunch of owls outside in the trees outside of their house, like a bunch of palm trees and other trees, right? They live kind of in the hills, and they're all hooting, and I'm a little more than a quarter Sioux. We believe that owls are the messengers of death. So of course this whole trip is just awful, and the owls are going crazy all night, and I'm just thinking, oh man, it's really close here, the end. And so I'm laying in bed, and I can't fall asleep, of course, because the owls and the wind, and I'm in my cousin's room, and it always feels like there's a presence in there. And I closed all the doors. He had his own bathroom in there, and he had a closet still full of his clothes, and I closed both of those doors because I'm not about to take any chances, right? Kind of a key point, there's at the end of his bed, at the foot of his bed, in front of to the side of the closet, is a black, kind of like glossy black with gold trim media cabinet, super 80s. His room never left the 80s, which I aside from the creepy factor, I always admired his room. I thought it was kind of a cool time capsule. But anyways, so all the furniture in there is very 80s, and this media cabinet is not exempt from that. And so it's got those kind of glass doors where you push in on them and they click and it'll pop the door out so you can open it, magnetic kind of closure. And those doors are closed. I can see the contents inside and all that. There's some personal belongings and whatnot, but the doors are closed. And so, that'll be important later. So I'm laying there and my phone's on the charger, and I'm trying to fall asleep, and it's not working, right? So I pick up my phone and kind of try to read some things and play a couple of games so I get sleepy, and eventually I do. So, but with being very worried that something weird was going to happen that night, I thought, you know what, I better check my surroundings and take note of what's around me in case I wake up so that I know that this is not a dream. Absolutely not a dream. So to my left, I'm laying on my back on the bed, and to my left, there's a nightstand. Well, there's a nightstand to my right, but more importantly, there's a nightstand on the left, and it has a clock on it. One of those black standard digital alarm clocks with a big red display, kind of easy to read. And the time read somewhere past midnight. And there's also a lamp in kind of a shell pastel pink. It's like ceramic lamp, very 80s, with a kind of a white pleated lampshade. My phone cable kind of running over the little nightstand to a wall socket behind it. And so I look at all that, and then I move my sight to a Depeche Mode poster on the wall, which was just, he taped it. My cousin taped it on the wall, of course, and the tape got old and one corner was falling off, so I noted that. And then he also had this huge, like really tall sound system, like 2 huge speakers, and like the amplifier and cassette tape deck. It's like an 8 cassette thing. It was like probably really, it was very fancy and probably very expensive back in the day. And so I looked at that and took note of that, and then I closed my eyes, and eventually I fell asleep. It felt like about 15 minutes later, I wake up, my eyes shoot open, and my head is leaning to the left. And you know that feeling you get when someone is watching you? I definitely woke up knowing that I was being stared at by someone, I guess. And I knew they were at the foot of the bed. I was like, oh my God, there's someone there, and I'm not looking there yet. I need to double check that this isn't a dream. So I kind of like I was sleeping on top of the covers, because I was kind of too paralyzed to get under them if I needed to bolt out of the room, right? I'm 20, but I'm still a weenie, right? So I like grab the covers, and there's the tactile feel of the covers and the sheets, and then I look at the alarm clock, and I know I wasn't specific on the time earlier, but I distinctly remember it being 2:34 a.m. And I looked at that alarm clock. I was like, okay, it's 2:34. I'm gonna look at the lamp. I looked at my phone charging, the cable, looked at the Depeche Mode poster, and then looked at the hi-fi system, or, the speaker system. And then I was like, well, all right, let's get this over with. So I look to the foot of the bed, and I absolutely freeze. Because there is indeed someone standing there. And I can only describe them as being really tall, like probably 6 foot. I assume, because of the build of the person's body, that it's a man, very broad-chested, wide-shouldered. They were wearing a black suit, a white shirt, dress shirt, all very crisp, a black tie, looked relatively modern. And of course, it wasn't a person looking at me, but a skull with a pair of eyeballs. No face, no skin, nothing gory, no blood, just a skull. And 2 eyeballs with red irises, like burning fiery fire engine red. And they were looking at me, just like this guy was looking at me. And I was like, I just innately knew this was death, or, the Grim Reaper, or whatever, what have you. I mean, it wasn't human. There's no possible way. And we looked at each other for a while, for what seemed like a while, but it was probably only a couple of seconds. And I felt this huge, just this insane insane, intense gravity to the energy coming off of this being, this whoever, death, I guess. And it was evil, but not in like the malevolent sense. It was just kind of like dark, like the rain cloud that had been following us around. And it was really, really intense. But I also knew that he wasn't there for me. I mean, I didn't have that sense of fear like I was going anywhere. I just was scared because there's this, 6 foot tall guy in a suit with a skull for a head staring at me with red eyes, right? So I looked away. I looked back to my left. I looked at the speaker system, the poster, the lamp, the clock, the phone charger, all in reverse, so I could recount it accurately. So I knew that I absolutely was not dreaming, because I don't have those kind of lucid dreams normally. Like if I'm able to control it, it's still pretty outlandish, and I never really, I never remember my dreams this vividly after the dream occurs, after I wake up. I mean, there's been a couple of times where I've wanted to write dreams down because I'm like, oh, that would make a great book or a great script, but eventually, if I don't write them down, the memory fades, except for like the most violent or intense parts of the dream. This, as I'm recounting it to you, I remember plain as day, So anyway, I looked at all the things, again grabbed the bed sheet one last time, and then I looked back to the end of the bed, and no one was there. But two things had changed. The closet door was open. Oh man, gives me chills remembering that, because the closet was dark, and I always felt like something lived in that closet, I swear. But anyway, the closet was open. The closet door was ajar. It wasn't like swung wide open, but it was ajar. And the media cabinet, the left, if I'm looking at the media cabinet from the bed, the left door, which would be the right if I'm the media cabinet facing me, the left top glass door was open. And I closed all doors. And there's no way that it opened unless, maybe I walked and opened them. That could be a possibility. But there's no way that my sleepwalking had anything to do with the guy standing there looking at me. So needless to say, I got back on my phone, tried to distract myself and read something until I just was forced to fall asleep, because I had to get up early in the next day, and we had to go continue on our way on our trip. So I wanted to try and get some sleep, because I knew I wouldn't be sleeping very well in the car. So I eventually passed out, woke up. It was a sunny day the next day. Wind had stopped. Nothing wrong with the room. No one there. And it was just a really freaky night. It was the most intense paranormal thing I've ever experienced. I've certainly had my run-ins with ghosts and spirits and etc. And take that with a grain of salt. Doesn't matter to me. But I know that I met death or some form of something that night. And I don't know to this day why he was there. Because if he wasn't there for me, I don't know if he was just warning me that my aunt was going to pass away, but I mean, I would at least have expected him to visit my dad instead, because he was much closer to her than I could ever be. But yeah, that's my story, and sorry if it gives you the heebie-jeebies, but I hope you enjoyed it.
Our next story is from Jennifer, and she tells us about an experience she had spotting a mysterious object in the sky when she was younger.
Okay, I was asked to do a recording of my experience that me and my family had back when I was younger. We were all woken up in the middle of the night, and it was my two brothers, my mom, and my dad. And this was in Everett, Washington, by a lake that we live by. It's called Silver Lake. But we were, I don't know, a couple blocks from the lake. But we all got woken up in the middle of the night. The only thing you could really hear was the hangers in the closet clinking against each other, because back then they were metal. So we all looked out the window and we saw basically something being covered up. The whole sky was covered by this floating city, is what it looked like. A giant spaceship. And it was huge. You couldn't see the sky. And then all of a sudden, the lights went on. And the lights were so blinding that it made your eyes burn and water. I've never seen lights as bright as this. All I remember is my Doberman going under the bed and hiding, and she was not afraid of anything. But I remember my parents yelling at us to stay away from the windows, because I don't know, I wasn't scared. I was wanting to see and intrigued by it. So I started going towards the windows, and I remember my mom and dad yelling, "Get away from the windows." So anyway, the next thing we know, it was gone. Like, I didn't even see it take off. That's how fast it was. But yeah, it was an amazing experience. I remember my parents telling us not to say anything to anybody, because we would end up in a loony bin, because people would think we were crazy. So I never really told anybody other than friends all through growing up. I've never seen anything like it ever again, and I probably won't see anything like it ever again. But it was amazing. And I know for a fact that it was nothing that our military back then, because I was probably 11 and I was born in 1975, so we didn't have that kind of technology. And I don't even think to this day, I don't think we have that technology to make a floating city. I mean, it was amazing. I can't even begin to explain how much in shock we all were. So anyway, I just wanted to share my story and let everybody know that it's real and we are not alone.
And our last story comes from Serenity, and she tells us about the terrifying feeling of being hunted by an entity.
Hello, My name is Serenity. I'm 27 years old, and this is the story of my encounter with a dark entity that haunted me after my grandmother passed away. I was 21 years old when my grandmother, who raised me, died from cancer. Her death was, as you can imagine, exhausting and mentally draining. The toll of it all forced me away from college and made me return home to the house she and my grandfather built. It wasn't finished. There were parts of it that weren't completed. The basement was not dug out all the way. And her bathroom and closet were never fully finished. It was surrounded by red clay in the country, in the US. Towering old cedar trees and country folk and hunters and carpenters who were hardworking, God-fearing people. No one could have understood what would happen with her death, though. The house no longer felt like a home when I entered the door. I brought my luggage from the dorms inside and brought it to her large walk-in closet. And I considered that the house belonged to me now, but in truth, I didn't want it. When I looked around, when I walked into that door, it felt as though she'd never been there. Her clothes were present, as were her jewelry items and the white bedding she loved. But her laughter no longer resounded with her voice. The warmth she exuded had gone as well. Leaving the master bedroom that she had inhabited, that used to be a safe space for me when I was a child, cold, and it felt stagnant. It was as though all the living color and safety that this home once held had been snuffed out with her passing. And standing there inside this large closet, I suddenly felt anxious. I gravitated to her clothes that hung neatly in the closet, pulling out a favorite pink shirt and bringing it to my nose to smell it. She was a chiropractor, so she always smelled like baby oil and Shalimar perfume. It was comforting, and I wanted to feel like a piece of her was still with me. I wanted to smell her scent there one more time, but when I pulled the shirt to do this, there was no scent. It was like it had been erased, and that feeling left me empty. For the first time since the night she died, I cried, standing in the middle of this closet, thinking to myself, what do I do? How do I fix things? How do I keep going? Now that she was gone, I didn't know what to do. My biological mother was living with me at the time, as was my college roommate and my siblings. Yet, I honestly had never really felt more alone. So I found myself standing there, contemplating what to do as I tried coping with losing someone so precious to me, grappling with the reality that the cancer that took her is genetic. And now I have to be afraid that myself or someone else that I love will fall victim to it. In all honesty, putting this into words is painful, confusing even. But it was in her passing that some of the worst things happened. I tried getting a better grasp of my emotions after a few minutes, wiped my eyes, and started leaving the closet, shut the door behind me, and then out of the corner of my eyes, I saw it for the first time. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It had features that I could make out, but just barely. No facial features, though. Just a tall, thin frame with clawed hands. It looked like it was black as night, and it exuded a feeling of fear, of misery. It was a sensation of death. I walked out of the closet of the room and shut the door. I never looked up from the ground, and I pretended like it wasn't there. But when I went to my room where my roommate and sister were, they asked why I was so pale, if I was okay, and I brushed it off. I was like, "Oh no, don't worry, I'm just tired." And I was. I was tired. I was heartbroken. I was trying to ignore a grieving process that ultimately caused me to suffer in the long run. But I didn't mention the shadowy figure, hoping it was nothing more than my exhausted brain coming to terms with whatever I could, whatever had happened. But that was the worst mistake I could have made. In the coming months, things began to change. I noticed the shadow in the room and the door was open, so naturally, I really let it stay open. Yet, sometimes the kids would leave it open and I would be face to face with the shadow. Eventually, my mom and youngest brother came to where they were sleeping in the room all the time. And I kept trying to ignore it. But something never felt right in the house. It was these little things at first. Missing items, small arguments that would happen on occasion. But that steadily changed into something more malevolent. There were arguments that started breaking out more, and things became borderline abusive. My siblings were telling me how they didn't feel comfortable in the house. Someone was always watching them. My roommate didn't like going to my grandmother's room, and my mom started getting sick. And then one night, my little brother was going to bed, and my mom was working the night shift, so I took care of doing that. He was only 6 at the time. And I was going to do what I would have normally done. I was going to turn the closet light on and shut the door so the other older kids wouldn't bother him so he could get to sleep. But he told me not to shut the door. And I was thinking, okay, he's a little kid. You know, they're scared of the dark sometimes. I'm almost 30 and I'm still afraid of the dark. So I imagine that's what he was too. But then he said something that made my heart almost stop. He said, the shadow man will come if you shut the door. And then I realized he was seeing it too. I had said nothing, decided not to give it attention just on the off chance that it wasn't an hallucination. Other supernatural entities that my entire family had seen in the past, a blue dog that smelled like roses and death, and a short goblin-like creature with green skin and black veins, bearing razor-sharp blades for teeth and sharp, thick yellow claws, did come to mind when I first saw it, but I didn't think anything of it. A part of me wanted to think that it wasn't supernatural, that it was a manifestation of the mind, and that the other two things were all that we would see, but now I was questioning that choice to ignore that part of my mind that told me not to doubt what I was seeing, and that I needed to be afraid. But I had a little kid who was scared, so I did the only thing I could. I pretended it wasn't real, that it was a nightmare that he'd had, and that nothing could hurt him. I did what any adult would do. I pretended it wasn't real just to give him some comfort, even while I was looking at it from the corner of the room. But it just kept getting worse. And each time it got worse, the entity started to move. It would move closer and closer to the doorway of the bedroom. And each time it did that, there were more arguments. We ended up losing our house. And this horrible, cold feeling of dread kept coming closer and closer. At 22 years old, the house that I had been given by my grandparents went into foreclosure. I had dropped out of college. I didn't have a job, and I had nowhere to go. Things were stressful, of course. But then, one night, my mom took my youngest brother to the grocery store with her, leaving us alone for a few hours while my roommate and I attended to the kids. Something had happened to where my sister and brother got into this argument. Kids fight, you know how it is. And the next thing I knew, I hear a baseball bat collide with the door frame. It's one of those distinct, heavy, deafening sounds. Something you really can't mistake for anything else. And it sent a chill up my spine. I was in the kitchen where I had a clear view of my grandmother's room, where the shadow now stood at the foot of the bed. My sister started screaming and crying, and I panicked. I ran to try to get between them. And my brother swung the bat at my head. This was a kid. We were 10 years apart. His eyes were wide, and he looked wild. His face was twisted in anger. He didn't look right. I told my roommate to grab my sister, and I did the only thing I could think of. I told her to take her to my grandmother's closet and lock the door behind her. I pushed my brother back, and we ran into it. He swung the bat a few more times, but he missed us. We locked the door, and I called my mom, and honestly, I kind of thought that was the end of it. My brother got into therapy, and, well, we just kind of assumed it was just the culmination of everything that had happened so far, and I kept thinking, okay, now the monster will go away. But it kept getting worse. The house was always cold, no matter what we did. We started packing up things to move somewhere because we ultimately lost the house. My mom and I started getting into terrible arguments. They were mostly just screaming and shouting. She called me things that I knew she wouldn't call me. It wasn't like her. And also, I threw things, hit walls. I started wanting to commit suicide. In the shadow, it kept coming closer to the door. Eventually, everything came to a head, and I went across the street to my great-grandmother's with my roommate. My uncle helped us move and keep what I wanted from the house, and I stayed with my great-grandmother for almost a year. During that time, my mom continued to live in the house for a while, and we didn't really talk. She and my roommate and my siblings thought that I had abandoned them. It was kind of strange. And then things started to look up for a little bit. I got a job, as did my roommate, and we started saving up money to move into an apartment for the first time. And my mom, well, she finally left the house. We didn't talk, but things were looking up. And then I saw a creature in the hallway at my grandmother's. The bad thing is, my roommate saw it too. And then my great-grandmother one night told us that she had seen things in her house. Unnatural things. Evil things. And I got the worst feeling that it was the shadow from across the street. My roommate and I talked about it often, sleeping in the guest bedroom of my great-grandmother's house, sitting up in the middle of the night, because you would hear scratching, these strange sounds from the hallway that connected into the living room. It made me feel like something bad was going to happen again, and it did. I lost the job I had because I have a knee injury that I sustained a few years prior. I dislocated my right knee out of the socket and put it back in by myself, and despite doing it right, because of the way it had been, there were lasting damages. I had to take a break on a 6-hour shift, leaned up against a wall, this 2-story restaurant, and I couldn't walk because of the seize up of my knee, and they fired me. Things were weird after that too. My roommate started having car trouble. There was just so much. Too much. It was frustrating and kind of scary even, because I was beginning to think that maybe I was cursed. Then a light shined through for us at last. I had some property left over from when I inherited the house that was from not attached to the main house property. But the person who had bought the house couldn't access it. So what I did is I sold it. And me and my roommate used that money, and we got our first apartment. It was a place in the middle of a not great area in our state, in a city not far from where I grew up. The apartment was a complex built like townhomes and was income-based. It was cheap. And, well, there you go. We slept on a blow-up mattress in our living room for the first 4 months, eventually getting a bed when my great-grandmother gave it to me. And I still use it today. We were sharing a room, and while I didn't have a job, my roommate did, and so I was often left alone in the apartment. I had a dog at the time, but sadly he passed while we were here. It was not related to these circumstances, but that didn't make things better. One day after my dog had passed away, I went downstairs. I was going to fix something to eat and go back upstairs, do some writing, do some other work that I had to do. Things were fine, and I was coping with the loss of my animal and just everything that was changing in life. I thought it was over, that we were okay, and then I saw it again. It was standing in the corner of the living room, but this time it was clearer. There are more details to its appearance. I looked at it dead in the eyes, these black hollow sockets, and it smiled. The sight of it made me feel sick, and I fled from the kitchen and upstairs. I locked myself in my room, and I had a panic attack. Things were getting worse, too, at least on an emotional level. I was having mood swings, panic attacks, anger spells, outright becoming more and more aggressive, and having trouble with breathing problems and body pains. During the time at this apartment, I ended up being diagnosed with fibromyalgia and bipolar disorder. I want to remind you, at the time of this, I was 23. Finally, I suspected the entity was now a thing that was just because of my mental illness. I started medication for it. I was doing okay. I got another dog whom I still own. She's 3 as of writing this story and telling you this story. And I was making progress on coming to terms with everything that had happened. But there's always more to the story now, isn't there? Slowly but surely, my roommate began to see the entity too when it was edging closer to the stairwell, eventually coming up to stand by the front door and then the stairs. We would run up the stairs at night after shutting the lights off, leaving the landing light on at the top of the stairs. We'd sleep with the TV on. For light, for sound, for anything that wouldn't let us know that it was getting closer. It was scary. Then I started to ask myself, why is it following me? What did it want? I began to question these things, and each night it drew closer and closer to the bedroom. And then, one day, it finally came inside the room. I had never had sleep paralysis before, but I'd always imagined it was scary, and I was right. It is. The first one I had was on a bright summer day. My roommate was playing a video game, and I was sleeping in because I hadn't got much sleep the night before. This was when I had the first sleep paralysis episode I'd ever experienced. I woke up from my nap and my whole body was frozen. I couldn't move, I couldn't blink, and breathing was difficult. I knew I was awake because I could hear my roommate playing the game. My dog was sleeping on the bed next to me, and things were normal. But the entity now had a face. For the first time in a year since I had begun seeing this thing, I saw what it truly looked like. Tall, emaciated, blackened flesh like it had been burned. Long, sharp nails of equal color, fanged teeth, and wide eyes that bore no pupil or iris. Atop its head were antler-like horns, and it crouched to fit in the corner of the room. I stared at it in fear and panic and doubt, and thinking, this thing's gonna kill me. It smiled, exposing an evil grin that split up to its ears in a garish glass-skull grin. It had jagged teeth. I wanted to believe I was having a nightmare, that this creature was just a figment of my imagination. and then it walked over to me and grabbed me by the throat. I felt corpse-like cold fingers touch my skin and putrid breath that stunk of decay on my face. And it spoke to me. You will never escape me. I sat up screaming. I went into a panic attack. It was horrifying. One of the worst things I'd ever experienced. And my mental state suffered for it. My suicidality went up significantly, and so did my depression. And this entity, I feel like it fed off of that. Eventually, I started waking up with bruises, strange scrapes that shouldn't have been there, and I even had a bite once. It was hard to even come to terms with these things happening, and I started to feel like I was being hunted. My roommate saw it on several occasions, and so did other people, saying that the apartment was freezing constantly, that it reeked of something rotting, and mold began to grow on the walls, and the hinges of the doors and vents. It was everywhere. My roommate and I, we just left. We moved out 9 months after living there, and she had got a better job. Our second apartment was great. It was in the city, 30 minutes away from the thing that had haunted us. We were doing good, had a nice home, good finances finally. Things were looking up. Eventually, though, my mom had come to stay with us due to her having to move apartments. Her old one had bugs and other unsavory things. But in the time that they were there, my little sister would come into my room at night. She was about, I want to say 12 at the time. And she would tell me about a woman at her old apartment who stood in a tattered, bloodied dress with matted hair in her stairwell at night. Her teeth were exposed because she had no lips, but she spoke. Guttural whispers about how she liked to kill families. And it terrified me. I was beginning to think that there was no end in sight to these things. I mean, could you blame me? I told her not to worry about it, that God would protect us, and that she needed to pray and it would help. Because it had for me. I started praying a lot, and while I'm not what I would deem an ideal Christian, I pray for safety and try to do what's right. But these things wouldn't go away. A year after we moved into the second apartment, we were moving out. Rats, black widow spiders, mold, peeling floors and rotting walls. You named it, it happened. We both started getting sick, and we both saw the thing again, standing by the fireplace. My heart sank when that happened. Eventually, my mom and siblings moved to their current place, and my roommate and I moved into an apartment even further away from my hometown, but still in the same state. We now live in almost an hour away from where I grew up, and while that particular entity hasn't shown up, save for one time, other things have happened. The sleep paralysis has stayed. It's never went away. My mental state's improved, but I could argue that there are still other things that are bothering us. In our current place, we actually do have a ghost. We have two. One is a nurse, and she makes rounds between our bedrooms every night. You can hear her shoes clacking on the hardwood floors, maybe even her pen scratching on the board. She peers into the room. She's got a warm, gentle light to her. She watches over us and makes sure that we're okay when we're sleeping. She's warm and kind and feels compassionate and protective. The stark contrast to what we've been dealing with for the last few years, huh? The second is a cat, strangely. But 2020 was a bad year for all of us. My roommate and I in our small apartment with our two dogs and a cat had to deal with the entity trying to come back into our lives. But we think maybe the nurse spirit is trying to protect us from it. My mom.
Thank you for joining me today in the Mystic Lighthouse. All stories submitted and narrated are purported to be true. The Mystic Lighthouse is produced and narrated by your host, Bo Carver. If you have any stories you would like to tell, you can submit them at themysticlighthouse@gmail.com. And tune in next week for